Hi statistics class, this is your first guided notes video that we're going to be using during this quarantine weirdness. It's lesson 1.1 over quantitative variables. So if you don't have your notes yet printed out, pause the video and go print them out because we're going to be filling out the notes. It's a lot of basic vocab and just how to make graphs and stuff, and yes, you're capable of following along, but if you just do that then you won't have a complete set of notes. So you're going to want to actually go and fill out the notes. So again, this is on the first part of it. We're looking at displaying data with graphs today. So statistics, that is the class that you're in. It's just the science and art of studying and analyzing and collecting and drawing conclusions from data, which is what I collected from you if you took the survey that was on Google Classroom. Now, you had to have taken it by 9:30 tonight because that's when I deleted those links and went ahead and pulled the data. So not everyone in the class is represented, but that's honestly nicer because we're going to have a smaller data set and it'll be a lot less painful to go through and collect data from this. So this is the 4-question survey that I had you take. So that's weird. So I asked your gender and I asked the age of your oldest parent. And then this question actually was different depending on the hour that you were in. So for third hour students, I'm pretty sure yours said greater than 10,000 for the population of Pierre. Fifth hour, I changed that to greater than 100,000. So it was still a yes or no question, but we're going to eventually look at the effect of this number and how large I made you compare it to first on your estimate as a class, your estimate of this population of some city that you know probably very little about. So the class data, I'll eventually link on the Google Classroom. I haven't done it yet, but I will at some point. We're going to be using that classroom data to study some variables. So a variable is any characteristic, any number, or any quantity that can be measured or counted. So if I instead asked your hair color, that's a variable. Your estimate of the population of Pierre is a variable. The age of your oldest parent, your gender, those are all variables. We can further classify those into different types of variables. A categorical variable. Nicely referred to as categorical because it's essentially like a category. It's going to assign labels that place each individual into a particular group. So for example, that hair color I mentioned earlier, I'd have a group of blondes, a group of redheads, a group of bald people, and it's just categories I could place people into. Strangely enough, it technically can be numbers. So your zip code, yes, it's a number, but it's not really measuring anything about you. It's just describing your location. So I could have a group of you guys who have Godfrey zip codes and a group of you who have Alton zip codes. It's just categorizing you. So those are different categorical variables. You can also have quantitative variables, sounding like quantity. So these will always be numerical values. So it's going to be counts or measurements. So when I ask the age of your oldest parent, that is a quantitative variable that I was studying. If I instead ask the number of pets that you have, that's a quantitative variable. So all quantitative variables will be numbers. Not all numbers will be quantitative variables. So then we can further break this up into discrete or continuous variables. Discrete variables can only take on integer values. So my example for this is the number of languages spoken. When somebody asks you how many languages you've spoken, you might say, well, English, and I studied some Spanish. I'm not very great at it, but I guess kind of some Spanish. You wouldn't say, oh, I speak 1.4 languages. You would say either I speak one language or I can speak 2 languages. So those are only whole number values. And I say integers because technically we could have negatives, even though it's weird to think of something like that. But statistically, it could be that. So we throw in the term integer values for that. A continuous variable can be any value. So my example for that is height. You don't suddenly go from being 4 feet tall to 5 feet tall. There are all these increments in between that you would pass through. So it's any number on this continuous scale in between it. We also can have univariate or bivariate data. So when a study looks at only one variable, we're looking with univariate data. Uni meaning singular, like unicycle. So if I just asked, if your phone gives you those data usage, like it tells you how long your screen time, those are always really depressing every time my phone tells me that on Sunday. But if that's all I collected from you, that would be a univariate study where I just have one data value that I'm collecting from you. It would also be continuous because there could be any range of numbers that you, if I like measured it in minutes or hours or something, but it would also be quantitative because I would be measuring the amount of screen time you'd have. If you instead conducted a study that had two variables and we're looking for the relationship between them, that would be working with bivariate data, like bicycle, bivariate, so two types of data. So if I still took the cell phone use and studied that and collected that from you, but I also asked your age. So maybe I'm interested in how cell phone use changes with age. So then I'm looking at bivariate data and looking at that relationship. So the whole point of collecting this data is to make it meaningful. And one of the ways to draw meaning from it and display it is to create a distribution. So this tells us what values the variable takes and how often it takes these values. So let's say I talked about height. I would probably not have any 3-foot heights for our class because we're in high school and most of us are taller than 3 feet. So I'd list all the heights that are in our class, and then I'd maybe note that 3 of us were 5'5" and 4 of you were 6 foot tall, and I would have how frequently each of those values took place in our class. So we want to be able to summarize this. I want to be able to describe this. And so I'm going to go back to that survey I made you take, and I want to talk about the age of your oldest parent. So I got the data, and I'm really just interested in what that looks like. And it's probably going to be significantly different than my class was last year, just because I have a different group of people, different people who took it. Maybe some similarities because it's still high school seniors taking this, but I'm interested to see what's obvious, what I see from the data. So to do this, we are first going to create what's called a dot plot. It is one of the easier ones to make, even if it is kind of tedious to make, but it's just going to show the data values and it's going to have a dot above its location on a number line. So we're going to draw and label an axis, and I'm going to put the name of the quantitative variable underneath. If you don't label it, you will always miss points, so make sure you label your graphs of any sort. And we're going to include units of measurement to make it meaningful again. Make sure we scale the axes. So for example, let's say there is a 35-year-old parent and then the next youngest parent was like 42, and then I just start going by ones. This would be a horribly inaccurate. I want to actually have it scaled out. So we're going to have to work with, we're going to have to make sure that we're careful with that. That's part of what makes this process tedious. Start the horizontal axis at a convenient number equal to or less than the smallest value. So if the youngest parent was 35, maybe start at 34. We're going to have equal increments for our tick marks, and then we want to get slightly larger than the oldest parent that we're going to record here. We're going to plot the values by just putting a dot above the location on the axis that represents that particular aged parent. We're going to try and make them all the same size, and we're going to space them out. So I have our class data put into a spreadsheet here. We are interested in column C, the age of our oldest parents. And part of what can make making these tedious is theoretically I have to look through. I'm like, okay, who actually was the youngest parent? And by looking through, I can find there's a 37-year-old. And then I'm going to go and look for the oldest parent, which I actually think 60 is the oldest. Surprises me that they're that young. But either way, we got a 60-year-old parent. So I know my distribution, my dot plot needs to go from 37 up to 60. So I'm just going to start with that information. So on page 2 of your notes, it says create this dot plot. So I'm going to make a horizontal axis. I'm going to label it as age in years. I'm assuming you all reported years of our oldest parent. And then I know I have to go from 37, so I'm going to start at 36, all the way up to 60. I'm going to see if I can just fit them all by counting by ones. So as long as I keep it equally spaced, technically it's not wrong to like count by fives, but if you're making this by hand, you're going to have some difficulty plotting those dots. So to the best of my ability, I'm making these equally spaced. And you can kind of already see why this is a tedious process. Not the most fun graph to make. And I did condense mine a bit too much. I had a little bit of extra leftover space, but whatever, that'll be sufficient. So then I know there was a 37-year-old parent. I know there is a 60-year-old parent. And all the other dots are going to be in between. I don't really want to go find the next oldest. So one quick thing, if you are in Google Sheets, if you highlight your row, you should be able to usually right click it. I'm on an iPad right now, but you should be able to right click it. And if I hit sort A to Z, it is now sorted in numeric order. And if you actually watch the rest of the data, so for example, so this top row, I'm trying to circle and you can't. These top two, so there's a no, a yes, so a no, a yes, 7,024 some odd thousand. When I sort that from A to Z, those also change. So this 37-year-old parent, this 37-year-old parent did not say 7,000 for their estimate. They had said 12,000. So it's still linked together. So just pointing out that that's one nice thing about Google Sheets. So now I'm just going to use this data set and go make those dots. So I now know 37 was the youngest. There's 38, 41, 41. So there's a 38-year-old, a 41-year-old parent, and there's another 41-year-old parent. So I'm just going to place a second dot above that. So then I'm just going to keep going. I actually have my laptop out, so I don't have to keep giving you whiplash going between those two different windows that I have open. There are 42-year-old parents. I'm attempting to make these dots identical. Well, maybe. So that it's always representing the age of a parent, not like, whoa, we have this one really old parent and this one tiny one. Like, the size is not supposed to be communicating anything about their age. So then there was a single 43-year-old parent, so put one dot there. There were 4 45-year-old parents. And you'll also see, I'm trying to put, if there are 2 of one age, I'm trying to keep them all on one line. If there were 3 of one age, I'm keeping those on one line. It's making a graph by hand, so you're only going to be able to do so well, but that's the goal of what I'm trying to do here. So I got my 45-year-olds. There were 3 46s. There's 2 47s and a 48. Three 49-year-olds and 3 50-year-olds. One 51 and 3 52s. Two 53s, 2 55s. 54 57 and a 60. So it's just taking the numbers that could have just been in a spreadsheet, that are in a spreadsheet, and trying to communicate them in a slightly different way. We are going to describe characteristics that are evident from this dot plot. Ooh, that's a typo. This says stem and leaf plot. We are talking dot plots. So when I ask you this question, what characteristics are evident, I am wanting 4 things every time. This is similar to what AP will ask you if you end up taking the test. They almost always ask some type of question of just describe a graph, and they're wanting these 4 things. So one thing to note is just, where do you think the center would be? So if you had to like hold, if this was like 3D in the air and you had to hold your finger under it, like if you hold your finger here, would that be a balance point? Well, no, it would fall to the right. It's too heavy. What about here? That's a little closer, but I still think too far. And this is up for debate, but you're just basically trying to describe what's the typical age. Not necessarily what's the tallest, what's the most frequent, but what seems to be the center of this graph. Where would it balance? And personally, I think 47 or 48 seems pretty close to the balance, because there's a nice peak here, but it does slowly taper off to this side. So this could be debated, but my guess would be that 48, 47 is about our typical value. For our variability, when I ask about variability, this is just asking how spread out is this data. There are lots of mathematical ways that we'll get into describing variability, but we kind of started out with that with saying, well, the youngest person was 37 and our oldest parent was 60. That's a way of describing the variability, how different these values were from our class. So we'll talk center, we'll talk variability, we will talk shape. So there are 4 types of shapes. Well, not really see the next page, see the next part, sorry. I updated these from last year, but I clearly didn't proofread very well. There are 4 different shapes that graphs can take on. Let's see, do I want to get into that? No, I'll get onto that in a second. So basically just trying to say like, wow, we had a ton of people that were super young and then not a lot of old people, or vice versa, where there's a ton of old and, or kind of like ours where it's kind of centered in the middle. You're just describing the shape. What does it look like as a whole? What's the general trend? And then lastly, we're looking for any unusual features. So anything that kind of stands out. So you want to talk about any gaps. Now I get that, like, yes, there's a gap here, but that's not super unusual. Honestly, ours is, I was expecting, usually there's like one parent that's significantly older or on the younger edge, but ours are fairly kind of uniformly spread apart. But you might want to mention that there are some gaps on the older end of these parents. So you're just going through and mentioning all these things. And again, you will be expected to talk about all 4 of these. And the, not in order, but the acronym that I've learned to try and memorize these is CUSS. So we're going to remember to cuss when we do this. Talk about center, unusual values, the shape, and the spread of the data set. So when I talk about shape, we are just looking for a major peak. We're not looking for anything minor. So for example, yeah, this kind of went up and then down and up again. That's something minor. I'm not looking small scale. I'm pretending like if you zoom out, what are you in general noticing? So we're looking for clusters and obvious gaps. So the first type of graph is called a symmetric graph, just like in your geometry class years ago. You talk about symmetry. If the right side is approximately a mirror image of the left side, it doesn't have to be exact. I'd say our data is pretty symmetric here. Of these 4 options here, graph B is the most symmetric. Then a distribution is skewed to the right if the right tail is a lot longer than the left tail. So for example, graph D, most of these numbers are on the small end, and then it tapers way off to the side. There's not a lot of big numbers on this particular distribution. However, a distribution is skewed to the left if the tail is much longer on the left side. So you see that in graph C. You see it's really sloping downward to the left. So please note, it's the direction of the tail, not where most of your observations are clustered. I'm not saying this is skewed right because you got a lot of right values. It's skewed left because, yeah, you got a lot of right values, but it slowly spreads out to the left. And then lastly, some data sets will look approximately uniform. And this is if the frequency on the graph is all about the same. So yeah, there's some minor ups and downs and peaks here, but if you zoom out, the general trend is this is pretty flat topped. So graph A is an approximately uniform distribution. So we're going to put this all together and look at these distributions and kind of compare them. I'm realizing that this video is already pretty stinking long, so I think, sorry, I'm thinking out loud while I'm making things. I think we're going to throw this next one, but this is dot plots. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and throw this into another video so this one isn't ungodly long and take forever to upload to YouTube, and I'll do one more after this. So